For over 50 years, one family has been the living, breathing soul of the Grand Ole Opry. Their harmonies are not of this earth. A single angelic voice seemingly split into three perfect strands. They are true royalty. Emmylou Harris built her iconic band around them. Ricky Skaggs married into their family, and Vince Gill considers it the highest honor to sing with them. They are Grammy and CMA award winners, the very aristocracy of authentic country music. They are the Whites. And yet, it is more than likely that you have either never heard of them or you've forgotten they exist. How is this possible? How can a family be both royalty and invisible in the same city? This isn't one of those familiar Nashville tragedies of booze, pills, or a dramatic, fiery public flameout. This is a much quieter, more profound, and perhaps a more modern and heartbreaking tragedy. It's the story of what happens when you are the living embodiment of purity in a business that demands compromise, a bright, gospel-fueled torch left standing in the long, cold shadow of a new, glittering pop country skyline. This is the story of the gospel family the Opry never forgot, even when all of official Nashville did. Clarence "Buck" White grew up during the Great Depression in a world defined by two stark realities: backbreaking work and the church. His musical soul was forged by two opposing forces: the Sunday morning of the church, filled with the raw, terrifying power of full-throated gospel harmony, and the Saturday night of the border blaster radio, playing the wild, piano-driven Western swing of Bob Wills. He mastered both the sacred and the profane. He started a family, and his daughters, Sharon and Cheryl, grew up not learning harmony but absorbing it. Their blood harmony was an instinctive, perfect, genetic blend. For years, they were a local Arkansas curiosity, a perfect time capsule of American music. But the world outside was changing. In the 1960s, Nashville was desperately trying to shed its hillbilly image, creating the slick, string-laden Nashville sound of Patsy Cline. It was music made to compete with pop, and it actively suppressed the very roots the Whites embodied. So, when the family finally packed up and drove to Nashville in 1971, they weren't just arriving. They were musical refugees, bringing an authentic Old Testament sound to a city that was busy building a New Testament facade of pop and glass, and the city had no idea what to do with them. When Buck White and the down-home folks arrived in Nashville in 1971, they were met with a wall of polite, professional indifference. The city was at that exact moment at the absolute zenith of the Nashville sound. It was the era of Charlie Pride, Lynn Anderson's Rose Garden, and Tammy Wynette's Stand By Your Man. The music was lush, orchestrated, and produced for AM pop radio. Into this world walks a man in his 40s with his two teenage daughters, playing a bewildering mix of 1930s Western swing, 1940s bluegrass, and 1890s gospel. They were, in a word, baffling. They would go to the offices on Music Row, the collection of small, unassuming buildings where multi-million-dollar deals were made, and they would play for producers. The producers would listen, tap their pencils, and say something like, "That's just wonderful. That harmony is, well, it's just something else." And then the inevitable but. But what do we do with it? It's not country. This was the ultimate Nashville paradox. They were too country for country music. So they tried the other door, the burgeoning bluegrass scene. They'd go to the bluegrass festivals and the small clubs where the purists gathered. Here, they ran into the opposite problem. The bluegrass traditionalists, disciples of Bill Monroe, had a rigid, almost dogmatic definition of what bluegrass was. It was fiddle, mandolin, guitar, bass, and banjo, and then Buck White would sit down at a piano. A piano? In a bluegrass band? To the purist, this was heresy. The piano was the sound of the honky-tonk, the dance hall, the saloon. It wasn't the sound of the mountains. So, to the bluegrass scene, they weren't really bluegrass. They were musically homeless. They had fallen through the cracks of commercial categorization. They were too country for the bluegrassers and too bluegrass for the country industry. They were a living, breathing testament to the roots of American music in a town that was interested only in its future, commercially viable branches. So, what did they do? They did what Buck White had always done. They worked. They took any gig they could get. They played in tiny smoke-filled clubs in Nashville's Printer's Alley for tips and a plate of food. They played the early bird bluegrass shows on WSM radio, the 5 a.m. slot before the main broadcast. They drove hundreds of miles to play the WWVA Jamboree in Wheeling, West Virginia, a sort of little brother to the Grand Ole Opry. They played at any county fair, folk festival, or church social that would have them. They were surviving. They were not thriving. This was a brutal, humbling existence. Buck was a master plumber, a man who could have been making a comfortable middle-class living back in Arkansas. Instead, he was in his 40s, living in a small apartment in Nashville, dragging his daughters to gigs that paid pennies. The girls, Sharon and Cheryl, were in their late teens, an age when most young women are thinking about dates and school and the future. They were spending their nights singing in bars, learning the hard, unglamorous truths of a musician's life. It's during this period that their sound was forged in fire. They weren't just a family band anymore. They were a professional unit, night after night, playing for audiences that were often indifferent or drunk. Their timing became impeccable. Their harmonies became a shield. They learned to rely on each other in a way that most bands never have to. When the audience wasn't listening, the only thing you have is the music itself and the other people on stage making it with you. Their sound became a closed, perfect circle. And the other musicians in Nashville began to notice. This is the secret economy of Music City. There's the front-facing industry of stars and radio hits. And then there's the back-facing world of the session players, the songwriters, the pickers. This back-facing world is where the real respect is earned. And in that world, Buck White and the down-home folks were legends. The session players, the A-team guys who played on all the pop country hits, would finish their lucrative sessions on Music Row, and then they'd go down to the grimy clubs to listen. They would stand in the back nursing a beer and just marvel at what the Whites were doing. They marveled at Buck's piano, which could seamlessly blend the rhythm of ragtime with the soul of gospel. They marveled at his lightning-fast mandolin breaks. And most of all, they marveled at those harmonies. They couldn't understand how three people could sound so perfectly, so effortlessly, like one voice. The Whites had become musicians' musicians. It is the highest compliment in Nashville, and it is also a commercial death sentence. It means you are too good, too pure, too complex to be easily packaged and sold to a mass market. It's a ticket to a lifetime of critical acclaim and borderline poverty. They were stuck in this loop of respect and obscurity for several years, and then one day the right person walked into the right club at the right time. That person was Emmylou Harris. In the mid-1970s, Emmylou Harris was arguably the coolest, most credible, and most important woman in all of American music. She was the protege, the musical soulmate of the late legendary Graham Parsons. Parsons, the father of country rock, had died of an overdose in 1973. He had left Emmylou with a sacred mission to carry on his vision of cosmic American music, that holy high lonesome blend of rock and roll attitude, folk singer intelligence, and pure traditional country soul. Emmylou was putting together a new band, not just any band. She was assembling an acoustic ensemble that could play the hard-driving bluegrass of the Stanley Brothers and the mournful country of George Jones. She was looking for musicians who were, like her, purists. She was looking for authenticity. She didn't find it on Music Row. She found it in a small, dark club, listening to a pipe fitter from Arkansas and his two daughters. Emmylou Harris didn't hear an old-fashioned family band. She heard the truth. She heard that telepathic, blood-bound harmony and knew with the certainty of a prophet that it was the secret ingredient she had been missing. It was the sound of the Appalachian earth. It was the sound Graham Parsons had been chasing. In a move that stunned the Nashville establishment and made perfect sense to the musician's musician community, Emmylou Harris essentially absorbed the whites. She didn't just discover them, she hired them. Buck, Sharon, and Cheryl became core members of her touring band, which she would soon christen the Hot Band. This was their big break. But it was a strange one. They weren't the stars. They were the texture. They were the angelic, authenticating sound behind the undisputed queen of Americana. Overnight, their lives changed completely. They went from playing for tips at the VFW Hall in Donaldson, Tennessee, to playing sold-out theaters in London, arenas in Los Angeles, and the main stages of the biggest folk festivals in the world. They were sharing stages with Bob Dylan, with Linda Ronstadt, with the band. This period was their finishing school. It was their university education. They were no longer just a family band. They were part of one of the tightest, most professional, and most important musical ensembles in the world. They learned about intricate arrangements from Emmylou's brilliant musical director, Rodney Crowell. They learned about phrasing, about dynamics, about how to hold a massive, reverent audience in the palm of their hand. And Emmylou, in return, used them as her secret weapon. She put them in the studio for what would become some of her most iconic albums. They were all over her 1979 masterpiece, Blue Kentucky Girl. That album was a hard country statement, a direct rejection of the pop country and disco that was dominating the airwaves. The album's signature sound was the blend of Emmylou's soaring, vulnerable soprano with the airtight, familial harmonies of Sharon and Cheryl. And on one track, Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, Emmylou stepped back and gave the whites the spotlight. The song, written by Rodney Crowell, is a showcase for their harmony. It's breathtaking. It was a sign of what this family was capable of. Emmylou would take it a step further. In 1980, she released Roses in the Snow. This was not a country rock album. It was a full-blown, uncompromising acoustic bluegrass and gospel album. It was a move that her label, Warner Brothers, considered commercial suicide. The album went on to be a massive critical and commercial hit, proving there was a hunger for the real thing. And who was the heart and soul of that album? The whites. Buck with his percussive mandolin and old-timey piano. Sharon and Cheryl with their soaring mountain church harmonies. They sang on The Boxer. They sang on Wayfaring Stranger. The sound of that album is the sound of the whites wrapped around Emmylou's voice. During this incredible whirlwind apprenticeship, two other things happened that would shape their future and the future of country music itself. First, the bluegrass and folk world, which had once been skeptical of them, now embraced them. Their association with Emmylou Harris gave them an unassailable stamp of cool. They began recording for small, independent labels like Rounder Records, the most respected label in folk and bluegrass. They finally officially dropped the Down Home Folks moniker. They were now simply the Whites. They released albums like Poor Folks' Pleasure. These records were cult classics. They were beloved by purists, by folk radio DJs, and by their fellow musicians. They were, of course, completely ignored by mainstream Nashville radio. The second, and far more fateful event, happened within the chaotic, creative whirlwind of Emmylou's hot band. The hot band was a revolving door of the most talented young musicians in the world. It was a supergroup before the term was common. And one of the all-stars who came into Emmylou's orbit was a young, phenomenally gifted, almost frighteningly talented mandolin player and singer from Kentucky. His name was Ricky Skaggs. Skaggs was a bluegrass prodigy. He had been on stage with Bill Monroe at age 7. He had played with Ralph Stanley as a teenager. He was, like the whites, a purist. He was steeped in the traditions of the mountains, but he was also young, handsome, and ambitious. He wasn't content to just play for the folk festival circuit. He had a fire in his belly. He believed that this raw, traditional music, his music, could be and should be on the radio. He joined Emmylou's hot band, and he found himself standing on stage night after night next to Sharon White. The chemistry was immediate. It was musical, it was personal, and it was profound. Here were two people from identical worlds. They spoke the same musical language. They revered the same heroes. They shared the same faith. And they both felt like outsiders in the city they were trying to conquer. A musical partnership was born, and, not long after, a romantic one. So as the 1970s came to a close, this was the situation for the whites. They were in a very strange, very precarious position. On one hand, they were more successful than they had ever dreamed. They were touring the world with a music legend. They were respected by their peers. They were making their own critically acclaimed records. Sharon was in a relationship with the single most dynamic young talent in the traditionalist scene. On the other hand, they were completely invisible to the mainstream. The country music industry was in the full, rhinestoned grip of the urban cowboy craze. The sound of Nashville was John Travolta, a mechanical bull, and the slick pop crossover sounds of Lookin' for Love. The whites, with their acoustic mandolins and their 1930s-style harmonies, were the furthest thing from urban cowboy imaginable. They were still musicians. They were Emmylou's secret weapon. They were insiders with a front row seat to the industry. And they were total outsiders knocking on a door that refused to open. But the 1970s were ending, and the pendulum was about to swing. The world of country music was getting tired of its own slick plastic reflection. A deep primal hunger for something real was building. A musical rebellion was brewing just beneath the surface, and that rebellion was about to be led by the fiery young mandolin player who had just fallen in love with Sharon White. The entire world of country music was about to be turned upside down, and the whites, after a decade in the wilderness, were standing unexpectedly at the dead center of the explosion. The 1980s began with country music at its most pop. The urban cowboy phenomenon, sparked by the 1980 film, had pushed the genre into the mainstream, but at a cost. The sound was polished, string-laden, and often indistinguishable from the soft rock ballads playing on Top 40 radio. The industry was chasing the crossover dollar, and the music's traditional soul, the fiddle, the steel guitar, the high lonesome sound, was all but banished. Commercially, it worked. Artistically, it emptied the room. Artistically, it was a wasteland. And the real musicians in Nashville, the ones who had grown up on Hank Williams and Bill Monroe, were seething. They felt their heritage was being sold off, cheapened, and plastic wrapped. A backlash was inevitable. All it needed was a leader. That leader turned out to be Ricky Skaggs. In 1981, Skaggs, who had been the fiery musical core of Emmylou Harris's hot band, finally released his first major label solo country album, Waitin' for the Sun to Shine. The executives at Epic Records were terrified. The album was, by the standards of the day, an act of radical insurgency. It was full of fiddle. It was driven by mandolin. The harmonies were tight, raw, and high. It was, in essence, a bluegrass album played with the volume and punch of a country rock band. It was the antithesis of everything on the radio. And it exploded. The album launched a string of #1 hits, I Don't Care, Crying My Heart Out Over You. The industry was blindsided. It turned out that the mainstream audience, fed a diet of pop country confections, was starving for something with grit, something with roots, something that sounded real. This was the big bang of the new traditionalist movement. Suddenly the floodgates opened. The record labels, in a desperate panic to find the next Ricky Skaggs, started scouring the bluegrass festivals and the traditional clubs they had ignored for a decade. And who did they find? They found artists like George Strait, a quiet Texan who sang pure honky-tonk and Western swing. They found Reba McEntire, who was still singing raw traditional country. And of course, they found the band that was not only like Ricky Skaggs, but was, in fact, his new musical family. They found the Whites after a decade of being told they were too traditional, too bluegrass, and unmarketable. The Whites, Buck, Sharon, and Cheryl suddenly became the hottest commodity in town. The very things that had been their commercial poison were now their commercial power. In 1982, just after Ricky Skaggs married Sharon White, the Whites were signed to a major label deal with Warner/Curb Records. The down-home folks, the musicians, the band that was too pure for the industry, was finally, after 11 years of struggle, inside the fortress. And for a brief, shining, almost miraculous window of time, they did the impossible. They became mainstream radio stars. Between 1983 and 1985, the Whites released a string of hits that, for a moment, made them household names. These weren't watered-down, compromised versions of their music. This was their music, just produced with a clean 1980s polish. Their first hit was You Put the Blue in Me. It climbed into the top 10. The sound was unmistakable. It opened with Buck's rolling ragtime-style piano, a sound that hadn't been on country radio in 30 years. And the hook, the thing that grabbed the listener, was the crystal-clear, razor-sharp sister harmony of Sharon and Cheryl. It was a sound so pure, so different from everything else on the dial, that it cut through the static like a diamond. Then came Hangin' Around. It was an even bigger hit, peaking at #9. This was pure Western swing, a sound straight from Buck's 1930s border radio dreams. Again, it was built around his jaunty piano and those telepathic harmonies. They followed it with I Wonder Who's Holding My Baby Tonight, another top 10 hit. They were on a roll. They were everywhere. They were nominated for every award imaginable. They won the Country Music Association Award for Vocal Group of the Year in 1984, beating out massively popular acts. They were nominated for a Grammy for Love Is Our Cross to Bear in the 1980s, but they won their Grammy later as part of the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou soundtrack in 2002. This was the pinnacle. This was total vindication. Think about the journey. A decade earlier, they had arrived in Nashville as nobodies, playing for tips, being told by every executive in town that their sound was a relic, an antique. Now, those same executives were handing them awards. They were headlining the same stages they had once been lucky to open. And in 1984, they received the highest honor that Nashville can bestow. It's not a Grammy. It's not a platinum record. It's the one thing money can't buy and the one thing that truly lasts. They were asked to become members of the Grand Ole Opry. On January 7, 1984, the Whites were officially inducted. They were brought onto the stage by their friend, their champion, and now their son-in-law, Ricky Skaggs, and by the king of country music himself, Roy Acuff. This was the moment. This was the culmination of everything. They stood in that sacred 6-foot circle of wood, the circle they had dreamed of for decades, not as guests, not as visitors, but as family, as members. They had a permanent, lifetime key to the home of country music. For Buck White, now in his mid-50s, it must have been an almost unimaginable moment. The plumber from Arkansas, the man who had stubbornly, faithfully carried the torch for the old music, was now a star, validated on the industry's biggest stage. For Sharon and Cheryl, who had given up their teenage years to a grueling, uncertain life on the road, this was their reward. They were not just Emmylou's backup singers anymore. They were stars in their own right, queens of the new Traditionalist movement. It seemed like this was the new normal. It seemed like real country music had finally permanently won the war for its own soul. The Whites, along with Skaggs, Strait, and others, were the new establishment. They had done it all. They had reached the mountaintop. They had taken their uncompromising traditional sound from the churches and dance halls of Arkansas to the top of the radio charts, all without changing a single note of who they were. They were standing in the warm, bright light of that Opry stage, triumphant, and they had absolutely no idea that they were standing at the very edge of a cliff, and that a cultural tidal wave was, at that very moment, forming on the horizon. A wave that would not just end their radio careers, but would sweep away the entire landscape they had just conquered. The world was changing again. By the mid-1980s, the new Traditionalist movement, which had burned so brightly, was already showing its age. It was a reaction to the pop gloss of urban cowboy, but it was itself a retro movement. And in pop culture, retro never lasts. The industry, having mined the past, was now desperate for the future. The first sign of the change was an artist named Randy Travis. In 1986, his album Storms of Life became a multi-platinum monster. It was traditional, yes, but it was different. It was slower, more intimate, and had a new, clean digital production sound. The second sign was the class of '89. In a single year, 1989, a group of artists released their debut albums, and country music was permanently altered. Garth Brooks, Clint Black, Alan Jackson, and Travis Tritt. This was not a new Traditionalist movement. This was something else entirely. Their influences weren't Bob Wills and Bill Monroe. Their influences were the Eagles, James Taylor, KISS, and Southern rock. They hadn't grown up listening to the Opry on a crackling AM radio. They had grown up on 1970s arena rock, and they brought that sensibility to country music. Garth Brooks didn't just want to play the Ryman. He wanted to play football stadiums. He didn't just stand and sing. He flew over the crowd on wires and smashed guitars. The music was built for this. The production changed radically. The sound of the 1990s was born. The drums, which had been subtle in traditional country, were now massive, processed and booming, recorded with the same gated reverb technique used on Phil Collins records. The fiddles and steel guitars were still there, but they were often buried under layers of electric guitars, distorted and playing rock-inspired solos. The acoustic front porch sound of Ricky Skaggs and the Whites was gone. The entire business model of Nashville changed. It was no longer about selling records to a country audience. It was about competing with Michael Jackson and Madonna for a massive suburban pop audience. The goal was to get on MTV, not just TNN. And then, in the mid-1990s, the final permanent shift. A Canadian singer named Shania Twain teamed up with her husband, a producer named Robert Mutt Lang. Mutt Lang was not a Nashville producer. He was a rock god. He was the man who had produced Def Leppard's Hysteria and Pyromania, a C/DC's Back in Black. He He was a sonic architect of 1980s arena rock. Together, he and Shania created The Woman in Me and later, Come On Over. These were not country albums. They were flawless, multi-hundred-million-dollar pop albums that happened to feature a fiddle. The drums were programmed. The vocals were auto-tuned and stacked in dozens of layers. The songs were built on undeniable global pop hooks. The marketing was pure glamour, and it worked. Come On Over became the biggest-selling country album of all time, the biggest-selling album by a female artist of all time. This was the new Nashville sound. This was pop country, and it was a billion-dollar industry. In this new, glossy, supercharged arena rock world, where did the whites fit? Where did a man in his 60s playing a 1930s-style piano and his daughters singing pure, unprocessed, acoustic-based harmonies fit into this new, high-tech, high-gloss, sexy pop country machine? The answer was simple, brutal, and immediate. They didn't. The fall was not a sudden crash. It wasn't a scandal. It was a slow, agonizing, humiliating fade. It was the sound of a phone that just stops ringing. Their record label, Warner/Curb, which had so eagerly signed them during the new Traditionalist boom, now saw them as a liability. They were dated. They were antiques. Their last charted single was in 1989. After that, silence. They were quietly, unceremoniously dropped. The radio stations that had played Hangin' Around just a few years earlier now wouldn't even touch their new music. The program directors, all chasing the young, suburban, Shania Twain demographic, would literally laugh at a record that sounded like the Whites. The major tour invitations stopped. The big money gigs dried up. This is the core of their tragedy. It is a story that happened to so many of the traditional artists of the 1980s, even Ricky Skaggs himself. They didn't change. They didn't get worse. Their voices were as pure as ever. Buck's fingers were just as nimble on the mandolin and piano. The world changed around them with a speed and a finality that was breathtaking. They were, in less than 5 years, pushed from the very center of their industry to its absolute forgotten margins. They were musical exiles in their own hometown. They were still, of course, members of the Grand Ole Opry. That nobody could take away from them. But the Opry itself was becoming a legacy institution. It was where the old artists played. The new young pop country stars, the Garths, the Shanias, would make token appearances. But the real show, the real money was happening in the stadiums and arenas. The Opry became the whites' sanctuary, and also, in a way, their gilded cage. It was the one place in Nashville where the new rules of pop country didn't apply. The Opry doesn't care about radio charts. It doesn't care about glamorous videos. It cares about history. It cares about the circle. As official members, the whites had a standing invitation to play forever. And so they did, week after week, month after month, year after year. Through the entire 1990s, the whites would show up at the Grand Ole Opry house. They would step into that circle, and they would play their pure, traditional, acoustic-based music to a crowd of tourists who, for the most part, had no idea who they were. They were the living, breathing ghosts of Nashville's past. They were often the opening act. They would play their 3 or 4 songs, a tight set of perfect harmonies and joyful picking. And then they would clear the stage for the flavor of the month pop country star who was headlining that night. A star who often had 1/10 of their talent, but 10 times their sales. This is where the central, quiet tragedy of their story becomes so poignant. They still sang for God, but Nashville had stopped listening. This became their existence for an entire decade. They were living musical history, treated like a museum piece. They were the gospel family the Opry forgot. Or more accurately, the gospel family the rest of Nashville chose to ignore. They were a living, breathing testament to the city's own discarded soul. They were royalty, confined to the palace, while the rest of the kingdom partied elsewhere. To be erased like this is a specific kind of show business trauma. To go from Vocal Group of the Year to yesterday's news breaks most artists, filling them with bitterness. But this did not happen to the Whites. How did they survive the 1990s? They had an anchor. Fame was never the point. The work was. Their philosophy came from Buck White himself, captured in a simple phrase he often told fans, "It's not my music, it's just the music." They didn't see themselves as artists to be forgotten. They saw themselves as stewards of a sound. This philosophy became their shield. They focused on family and faith, leaning deeper into the sacred gospel music that radio had rejected. They never stopped singing, even when the industry stopped paying attention. The music was no longer for charts or radio play. It was for faith, for family, and for the circle at the Opry. And they weren't entirely alone. They built a real Nashville around them. Sharon and her husband, Ricky Skaggs, built an independent kingdom at Skaggs Family Records, creating a bulwark against the pop country tide. This real community included superstars like Vince Gill, who, at the height of his 90s fame, would show up at the Opry on his nights off, not to sing his hits, but just to stand beside them and sing harmony for free. The respect from their peers was absolute. This was their life, a quiet, dignified existence as keepers of the flame. They had, it seemed, accepted their fate, and that is how their story would have ended. But in the year 2000, the strangest thing happened. A pair of iconoclastic filmmakers decided to make a movie set in the Great Depression, and the cultural earthquake it triggered was about to drag the Whites from the quiet margins and place them at the dead center of the biggest phenomenon in music. And the cultural earthquake it was about to trigger would overnight take the Whites and their entire forgotten world from the quiet margins of the Opry stage and put them at the dead center of the biggest, most unexpected, and most ironic pop culture phenomenon of the new millennium. The industry that had abandoned them was about to come crawling back, utterly bewildered, asking them for help. In the year 2000, if you had walked into the glass tower office of any major record executive in Nashville and told them that the biggest selling album of the next 2 years would be a movie soundtrack, that would be plausible. But if you told them that album would contain no pop stars, no electric guitars, and would consist almost entirely of Depression-era folk songs, raw bluegrass, and 19th century gospel hymns, they would have laughed you out of the building. And then the film, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" was released. The film was a modest hit. The soundtrack, produced by T-Bone Burnett, was a cultural supernova. In a landscape dominated by Britney Spears and pop country, this raw, ancient album sold millions. It topped every chart and became a phenomenon. And who was right at the center of this inexplicable movement? The Whites. T-Bone Burnett, a producer who revered roots music, knew exactly who the true keepers of the flame were. He called Buck, Sharon, and Cheryl to record the hopeful Carter family anthem, "Keep on the Sunny Side." It was the perfect song for them, a hymn of resilience and faith. Suddenly the Whites were famous again. But this was a different kind of fame. It was cultural. The "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" soundtrack won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year in 2002. It beat U2, Bob Dylan, and Outkast. The Whites, who had been ignored by the industry, were now standing on the Grammy stage for the most important album in the world. This victory spawned a documentary, Down from the Mountain, and a sold-out national tour. Let that sink in. The whites, who had been relegated to opening slots at the Opry, were now playing to 20,000-seat arenas, and they were the stars. It must have been the most surreal and vindicating experience of their lives. For an entire decade, they had been told their music was worthless, old-fashioned, and unmarketable. And now the entire country, from college students to suburban moms, had proven that the industry was catastrophically wrong. The public was hungry for this music. As it turned out, the audience had never forgotten them. They had simply never been given the chance to hear them. This brings us to the final tragedy. Oh Brother was a vindication, but it was also a mirage. What did Nashville learn from this? Absolutely nothing. Music Row saw Oh Brother as a novelty record, a fad driven by a popular movie. They did not sign the whites or other bluegrass artists. They did not turn off the drum machines and turn up the mandolins. Instead, they ignored the phenomenon and went right back to producing the same slick, overproduced pop country they had always made. The brief window had closed. For the whites, it must have been the ultimate "I told you so," followed by the most bitter disappointment. They had been handed platinum-plated proof that their music was vital and commercially viable, and their hometown industry, once again, turned its back. And when the stadiums were empty, the awards were on the shelf, and the pop culture spotlight had moved on. The whites were right back where they belonged. They returned to standing on the sacred circle of wood at the Grand Ole Opry, their sanctuary, the one place that had never asked them to be anyone but exactly who they were. After the Oh Brother whirlwind subsided, life for the whites settled into its final, lasting rhythm. They were no longer forgotten, but revered, living legends of the Opry. This perhaps was the best of all worlds. They had the respect of the masses, earned on their own terms, free from the crushing demands of the commercial radio machine. Their true legacy was never about what they sold, but what they saved. They are the torchbearers, the living link to the foundational sounds of American music. In a culture obsessed with viral fame and branding, the whites offer a radical alternative, a life built on craft, family, and faith. Their story is the ultimate testament to a different definition of success, one measured not in dollars, but in decades of integrity. On January 13, 2025, Clarence Buck White passed away at 94. He had lived to see his old-fashioned music vindicated on the world's biggest stage. The circle remains unbroken. Today, Sharon and Cheryl, the White sisters, still perform on the Opry stage. The harmony is different now. The foundational note of their trio is silent, but the music continues. The tragedy was never that they faded. It was that the world they inhabited became too loud, too fast, and too shallow to appreciate their quiet, profound beauty. Nashville, for a time, stopped listening. But the whites never stopped singing. They weren't singing for the charts. They were singing for their family, for the music, and for God. And in the end, that was all that ever mattered.